Too zen. Once upon a time, I mistakenly thought of myself as a great fisherman, one of the best. It was a hard hook to swallow when it was demonstrated that I actually knew nothing about the sport. You don't see many Shaolin monks fishing on the Jefferson River in Montana. The first time I meet Chittum Skiffs was on a Wednesday. I remember because it was on my 20th birthday. Thinking back on our first encounter, I guess I only saw Chi because he probably wanted me to. He was tricky that way. Anyway, this is a story about my fishing enlightenment. As you might have already guessed, Chi was a mystical fly fishing master and I became his student. The day we met, there was just one cloud in the sky. It was shaped like a dragon, which I should have seen as a sign. There wasn't any wind that day, and I was fishing a lonely stretch somewhere between the Lewis and Clark Caverns and Limespur. I'd thought I had the river to myself, but found I was mistaken. In fishing, there's an unspoken etiquette concerning territorial boundaries. The general rule is to give any other fisherman at least 100 yards of privacy. I was working my way upriver, waist deep on a stony bottom, and casting into some very promising-looking water. That's when Chi appeared out of nowhere. You can imagine my surprise at seeing a short, plump, jolly Asian fellow, dressed in olive pajamas, suddenly fishing only 10 feet away from me. I hadn't heard his approach. Admittedly, my first reaction was outrage at the little Chinese Santa's intrusion. I couldn't believe his audacity. He was fishing right on top of me and unquestionably encroaching on my private fishing space. More vexing was the fact that the Buddha impersonator was fighting a fish he must have caught in water I'd just walked through only a minute earlier. In one hand he held an ancient bamboo rod, and he was waving around his other hand as if he were conducting an orchestra. The rod was bent like a candy cane, which meant he was hooked into a huge fish. He also had his eyes closed and was smiling. My mouth fell open in shock as I noticed he wasn't wearing any waders. He didn't need any because he was walking on top of the water. I just waded through that stretch and knew the water there was at least 3 feet deep. There were no rocks to stand on, and this guy was barely getting the bottom of his bare feet wet. I was about to say something, but before I could utter a word, the strange chirruped asked, "First time fishing?" Well, I'd been fishing most of my life, thought of myself as an expert, and was trying to think of a good retort when he bent over, offered his hand, and said, "My name is Chittum Skiffs." After shaking hands, he stood up, flicked his wrist, and caught the 10-pound rainbow he'd been fighting by the fly stuck in its lip, and held it there examining it. I don't know what he did next, but a split second later, the fish flopped back into the river and splashed my face. Wiping the water off my face and was about to say something harsh, but before I had a chance, the Chinese leprechaun grabbed my line and said, "That fly no work good." In a remarkable demonstration of sleight of hand, my fly was suddenly pinched between his index finger and thumb. He pinched off and flicked into the wool on my vest. Then, in a matter of maybe 2 seconds, he'd tied on a new fly, one looking much more like the current caddis hatch. He did all this with one hand, which made me realize Chi had some exceptional skills, besides being able to walk on water, which in my opinion was a pretty neat trick. He then tapped my rod, and the line flew off in a perfect cast. No catch fish if line no in water. Finally, I gathered myself and was about to ask how he had done these tricks, when Chi hooked into another big fish. This one must have been swimming around my boots. A second later, it jumped right out of the river and literally slapped my face with its tail. What could I do? Nothing. However, I couldn't help assuming my new friend had somehow caused that fish to insult me. Chi apologized, but he did so with obvious humor. Next, I witnessed something really extraordinary. With an almost imperceptible movement of his rod, the fish he was fighting came flying out of the water, spit the fly into Chi's hand, and gracefully dove back into the river. Then, to my amazement, before the fish had hit the water, the pudgy little monk had his rod disassembled and stowed in a small canvas shoulder bag. Standing there with my mouth open, Chi kicked my rod with his bare foot. Now this could have been an accident, but I doubt it, because once again my fly and line flitted out in a long, perfect cast. An instant after the fly hit the water, an enormous rainbow rose up and gulped my fly. I was pleased. Then the pajama-clad priest had the nerve to say, "You know nothing. You pull too hard, need more finesse. You want I teach you to fish good?" It was a hard question to answer, mainly because I assumed I was already an expert. But then the fish broke off and Chi laughed at me. Thinking about it, I had to admit that this fishing ninja seemed to know considerably more about the sport than I did. So finally, I said, "Sure, I'd like you to teach me how to fish." Chai then walked right over to me, placed his thumb on the center of my forehead and gave me a little shove. Well, it wasn't really like a little shove, it was more like getting hit by lightning. I must have fainted because the next thing I realized I was sitting in the river, with my waders filling with water, sputtering, and trying to hold on to my rod. Then suddenly something changed. The colors seemed brighter and my hearing improved. I'll never forget what happened next. I slowly started to rise off the river bottom as if I were levitating. Still in a sitting position, my feet splayed. I gradually rose to the surface, which defied all natural logic. After a moment, I found myself sitting on the surface on top of the water as buoyant as a cork. I then began to drift downstream with the current, slowly turning in circles. Chai then said, "Meet me here tomorrow, same place, I teach more. Bring me egg salad sandwiches." He then just walked away. I couldn't speak because I had an uncanny feeling of euphoria. After about 5 minutes of just grinning, I tried to stand, but fell. Water is slippery. I tried to stand a couple more times but kept falling over. After several more minutes, I drifted into the middle of the river, still sitting on my rump, as if in a float tube. I looked back upriver and she was nowhere in sight. All I could see was the dazzling light reflecting off the water for miles upstream. It took some doing, but I finally butt-squirmed ashore and eventually got back to my car. My dreams that night were filled with strange and wonderful images of a world condensed into a kaleidoscope of dancing animals, all painted in outrageously vivid colors. It was weird, but all was in harmony. Everything was connected, and it was the first time I could remember hearing music in a dream. I woke more refreshed than I'd ever felt in my life, and was back at the river at the appointed place as the sun crested the rim of the world. Again, Chi appeared right next to me without a sound and said, "You sleep good? Today you learn fish better. First," he said, "you learn breathe right." And then he taught me to breathe in a way that was so much more efficient, and I immediately felt 10 years younger. Then he had me stretch, and within minutes I could touch the palms of my hands to the ground with my knees locked straight. We then worked on my mind, and after 15 minutes of meditation training, I could go from intense activity to complete calm in the blink of an eye. And although I was a little put off by the mantra Chi prescribed, "Da," I suddenly became more aware and unquestionably more in touch with my surroundings. Then Chi rapidly ran through a series of demonstrations, giving a casting clinic the likes of which I have never seen. Using my fly rod, he deliberately cast my fly directly into a thorny tree, causing a horrible snag, one I would have considered hopeless to retrieve. But with some kind of amazing magic, Chi had the fly and tippet untangled with no more than the flick of his wrist. "No magic, just practice," he said, although even my most ardent fly fishing friends would have considered the trick unbelievable. In an hour, I was able to throw the entire fly line all the way down to the backing with laser precision. Chai then taught me how to feel where the fish were in the water, without seeing them, by opening my mind to their life force. And soon I was much better at walking on water, which was a huge advantage. As it turned out, Chi originally studied at the Wu-Tang Dragon Temple, but claimed when fishing, he used the Tibetan Oh-Mai Shan Crane school of teachings. And his technique did seem somewhat bird-like, although he was a rather plump crane. Chi had an immense amount of knowledge about healing, meditation, and nature. He told me he had dedicated his life to a quest for knowledge so he could help heal the world. Well, I spent the next 7 years studying under Chi. In that time, I have improved my fishing methods tremendously. Sure, he made stand on one foot for a month one time and had me doing one-fingered handstand push-ups until I was blue in the face. But those difficult exercises helped improve both my fishing skills and my attitude. Although Chi still considers me a mere novice rather than a qualified monk, I am able to do some pretty amazing things on the river, not the least of which is being able to walk on water. Sadly, Chi said farewell one day and disappeared into little twinkling spots of light. Since then, I have missed him greatly. I am grateful for his teachings. The most important lesson he taught me was to always consider myself a student and to seek knowledge always.